Chris Watkin, welcome to Apollo's Watered.
Thank you, Travis. It's wonderful to be here.
You say that to all the podcasters. I know you do.
But it is. Seriously.
But you mean it every time.
I love it. We get to talk about the most wonderful things in the universe, and the most nourishing and rich things for human beings. What is there not to like?
You just made like that the best introduction ever. Out of all of our show, that's going to be like the top highlight part. That excites me.
Do you know what that means though? That means it's downhill from here.
It's true. We've got no place to go but down. Well, are you ready for the Fast Five? Let's
go.
Okay. Now you have filled your book with a lot of contemporary references, and you spent some time talking about Rocky. And the reason that I want to bring this up is I actually introduced my kids to Rocky the other day. So here's my question for you. The best Rocky movie of all time is?
Oh, man, I only really know 4, because that's the one that we watched on the rugby tour that I went on a hard loop on the coach. So I'm going to have to say 4.
It's a really good one. I mean, it is pretty good. It's with Ivan Drago, right?
That's the one.
And You've never seen any of the others?
Oh, look, I've seen little bits. I'm not sure I've seen any of them all the way through. I know the iconic sort of, going up the steps scene and little bits, but I couldn't reconstruct the story for you.
Well, it's pretty easy. He beats everybody. He goes down and then he gets back up and goes over. I was actually disappointed because you talked about where it was filmed. I actually thought it was in Russia and it was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I was like, no, my childhood is ruined. Okay. You also talk about the Avengers. So here's the next question. If you were an Avenger, what Avenger would you be, or which Avenger would you be and why?
Well, the first Marvel character that comes to mind is Rocket Raccoon. I'm not sure if that's some sort of Freudian thing going on in my mind there. Look, I'd be someone who comes on and makes the tea and sort of makes sure they're fed and watered. I'm not a huge Captain America, certainly not a Hulk. My goodness me, I would be the anti-Hulk. If there's an Avenger called Anti-Hulk who never goes to the gym, that's me.
You could be, I think you would be the young Groot, because the Groot is just kind of quiet and on the sideline and then just totally wakes up and then surprises everybody. And that could be you.
So you mean I only ever say one word?
No, definitely. Well, that word means a lot of different things. So it translates to a lot of different things. All right,
the young Groot.
Young Groot. Number 3. You're a professor of French studies, but what's your favorite place? And I'm assuming you've been to France. So what's your favorite place to visit in France? And what is the best part of French cuisine? Pick a dish.
Well, the favorite place for me in France is a place that I have one of my most treasured memories. It's the Place des Vosges in Paris. So it's not super central tourist area, but it's pretty touristy. And I remember very distinctly sitting there with Alice and my wife one day. They'd put lavender in the square, so it looked like a field of lavender. And there we were. I was sipping my espresso and she was having her cappuccino, I think it was. It was just one of those moments that stays in your memory forever. One of those eternal moments. So that's my favorite place. Cuisine-wise, well, the day that I asked Alison to marry me, we went to this beautiful French, I did it in Paris. We went to this beautiful French restaurant. And I had garlic snails. And so that again is just wrapped up with the most precious memories for me. And so I'm going to go for the garlic snails.
You like snails? I've never had garlic snails before.
You're missing out, Travis. It's a unique taste.
It is
and a unique texture as well.
I've never had that before. You've made me want to try it. That's one of the things I do love about this show is I get to meet so many fascinating people and I hear about all these dishes because oftentimes I ask questions about food because I like food. And so I've just never had, I don't think I've ever had garlic snails. Now I really want to go, but in Paris nonetheless, that makes it even better.
Yeah, it's got to be in Paris.
Number 4, you've traveled quite a bit. And I know you've been to the US quite a bit too. The thing that you just don't get about Americans is what?
Oh boy, this is a minefield, isn't it? You're setting me up to get hammered. The thing that I love about Americans, one of the things that I love about Americans, and a thing that I find quite hard, is the directness. Because I'm British and we never say what we mean, but we all know what we mean. We can all navigate those circumlocutions and paraphrases, and we know what it really means. And then I go to America and people just let it all hang out. And it's, well, I was expecting you to be like really coy and ironic, and no, you're just telling me exactly what you think. And that's quite confronting. So that's something that I struggle with, but it's also just fantastic because you know where you stand.
I would have not guessed that, but I understand it. All right, number 5. If you could have a cup of tea with just one philosopher, who would it be and why?
Is Jesus a philosopher?
Well, no. I mean, he could be, but in this illustration, we're not going to have Jesus as because he could be. I mean, he's everything. He's everything, which is wonderful. Let's go with a non-biblical person.
Okay, I'm gonna give you 2 answers. The first is the guy that I wrote a book on recently, but never got the chance to meet face to face. So I'd love, having read almost all, I think, of what he wrote, I'd love to be able to chat with him. His name was Michel Serres, French philosopher, same generation as Derrida, Foucault, those guys. Much less well known, but becoming much more known now. Love to chat with him about the things I read in his book. And I think the other person, although it would be a very intimidating cup of tea to have, would be Blaise Pascal, the 17th century everything man. Like he was a pioneer of mathematician. He developed like probability theory, and he was crazily wise. And then he wrote this amazing book of apologetics. It was still in fragments in his day. He didn't get to finish it, called the Pensée. And just to listen to how he talks about the culture of his day is absolutely fascinating. And I would be really interested to see what he made of our day.
I might be depressed at what he would see at our day. I don't know.
Insightfully depressed, though.
Oh, yes. Yes. Their ability to see so many different things is overwhelming, really, at times, how prescient and how they could see where the cultures were headed. Oh, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Well,
he was just one line on him. You got me going now. He was talking about distraction and amusing ourselves to death back in the 17th century.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that
so? For him, the big thing about life in his day was distraction. People just too busy to stop and think. And if that was the case, pre-telephone, pre-TV, pretty much all the technology we take for granted, what on earth he would make of our day, I have no idea.
Wow. Well, let's transition then a little bit, because I'm very curious to hear your story, where you grew up. You said you're British, and how did you get from, just growing up, learning to want to be a philosopher? That always fascinates me, the people that want to be philosophers, but then to write a book on, as the title is, biblical critical theory. I know there's a lot there, but give us a little bit insight into your background and your faith.
Well, I didn't grow up as a Christian in the early years of my life. I guess I would have called myself normal, not even an atheist. Like Christianity wasn't even an option. It was, of course, there's no God. That's ridiculous. And I was happy. Like there was no God-shaped hole, to use another of Pascal's images. That was like, this is just life as it is, and I'm enjoying mine. Thank you very much. I don't need anything else. And the short version of a much longer story is that a trip to the battlefields of the First World War with my school at the time woke me up to bigger questions, not to God at that stage necessarily, but I was invited on that trip to go along to church by a friend of mine. So I went along. You do that sort of thing when you're 15, not expecting anything particularly to change in my world, but she was a good friend, and so we went along. And then over the course of, I guess, about 2 years, I got to the point where I couldn't walk away from Christianity. I don't think I was a Christian yet, but there was something about the way that Christians loved each other, and something about Jesus in the Bible that I didn't have categories for, I couldn't explain. Anyway, I became a Christian just after that time. And I guess even before that, I was really interested in big questions. That's probably one thing that drew me to Christianity. And that's also why I love philosophy. People say, don't they, sometimes that Christianity and philosophy are in, conflict, but I've always found a real kinship between them, because they're two of the groups of people, two of the very few groups of people in our society who are actually asking the big questions and are not just distracting themselves, as Pascal would put it, on a daily basis, but are stopping to think, hey, what is this all about? What is the meaning of this thing that we call life? And I love that. And that's, I think, why I love the French philosophers. So there's a very caricaturally Anglophone way of doing philosophy, which is you break things down and then analyze them. You're very careful, and you proceed very cautiously. And then there's a French way of doing philosophy, which is you grab yourself an espresso, you sit in the terrace of a cafe, you open your notebook and you write the title Life. You go for it. What is this all about? And that's the sort of philosophy that I love. You start with a big question, start where you are with existence, and say, what is this all about? And I love it. I love following people as they think through those sorts of questions. So, most philosophers I read, I don't agree with, but it's really interesting seeing how they piece things together, how they try and justify their position, what arguments they put forward, what they think's worth looking at and talking about out there in the world, and just to put yourself in someone else's shoes for a few hours and walk around and try and get a sense of what the world looks like to them. I think, if I didn't do philosophy as my day job, it's just a really pleasant pastime as well. It's really fascinating trying to think your way into how other people see the world. And I suppose that's where my interest in philosophy comes from. And then, of course, you've got to write books about it in order to sustain an academic career. So that's what I do.
So let's transition into the book then, because you're talking about philosophy, you're talking about these big questions of life, and I don't think I've ever encountered a book, and I know there's a lot of books out there that I've never read, that have tried to encapsulate so many different pieces of life as your book. I consider myself a pretty well-read person. I mean, I know that there's a lot of people out there that read a whole lot more than I do, but I've never seen a book so pregnant with philosophy, sociology, missiology, biblical studies, contemporary culture. You cross the gamut. It's as if I'm watching two different parts of the map. Like there's like the Bible world, and then there's a contemporary world. And it's like I'm seeing flight patterns, just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, over and over and over again. And it's a book that has got a lot of attention. What was the impetus behind this book, Biblical Critical Theory?
It was very personal, really. As an undergraduate in a large secular university studying arts and humanities, you become sort of an essay factory, don't you? You're thrown these books, every week, every couple of weeks. Here's 5 books of Marx, here's a pile of Freud, here's some Nietzsche, here's some Derrida, here's some Foucault. Go and pump out an essay on them, which I loved. It was fantastic. But there was, a sense of, I really want to understand how these people see the world, and I'm only getting about 4 or 5 days to write these essays on each of them. And that was a wonderfully intoxicating, sort of roller coaster ride. And then there was this other part of my life. I suppose it's what you were just talking about, this map with, 2 different continents, which was my Christian life. I was part of a church that took the Bible really seriously, by God's grace, and wanted to teach it thoroughly and have it sort of work its way into our lives. And that was fantastic as well. And there were precious few places where those 2 worlds touched in my life at the time. And I looked at all these different theoreticians, these critical theories, different ways of viewing the world and society and diagnosing what's wrong with it and saying what it should be like. And when I read the Bible, I thought, there's a similar set of ideas here. The Bible has a sense of what life is about, and should be and what's wrong with society and how it can be fixed. Now, it's more than that, of course. The Bible, is the word of God that makes us wise for salvation, and it thoroughly equips us for every good work. And all of that is absolutely true. But in addition to that, it is also performing these similar moves of critical theory. And it was frustrating to me that there was no way on earth that the Bible got a seat at the table in the units I was looking at. We did Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. There's no way we were going to do Paul or Jesus in those units. And similarly at church, the sort of philosophers that I was studying just didn't really come up. No particular fault of the church. It's just that, nobody had particularly read those people. And so I was thinking, how do these worlds talk to each other? What if the Bible unfolded a critical theory in the way that these different theoreticians are doing in my units? What would it look like? And how would it engage with these other critical theories that are being thrown around? And it really niggled at me. And I got to the point where I thought, look, if I do write a book, I think that's the book that I want to try and write. I want to try and bring those two worlds into conversation, and show that the Bible does have a critical theory, among all the other things that the Bible is doing as well, and that it is actually quite a surprising one to modern ears. Like, this is not your grandmother's Bible, in a sense. This is not what you think the Bible is, and not what you've been inoculated against thinking the Bible teaches. There are some really quite powerful, explosive, and delicious things that the Bible says about our society that take us off guard sometimes, but also set forth a really beguiling vision, a really attractive vision for how society could be. And I wanted to try and share some of that excitement, but also to put it down on paper for myself. I don't know about you, but I always find I don't really know what I want to say until I've written it, and I think through writing. And so I knew that writing the book would be a huge blessing for me, because it would make me think through these ideas and pursue them with a greater rigor than I had done. And that the story of how it actually came about is, I guess, a story with two chapters, really. The first one was the first Bible overview that I ever did, where I was a junior leader on a summer camp, a Church of England summer camp, where the 14 to 18-year-olds were being sort of taught the Bible and doing lots of crazy games. And I was one of the 18, 19-year-old junior leaders. And part of our program was that we had a teaching session every day, and it was a Bible overview. And I struggled to find words to express what a thrill it was to have my first Bible overview. I sort of knew the Bible was one story, but I didn't really know. I didn't viscerally feel the thrill of understanding that from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, this is one coherent narrative. Not a simple narrative, not a one-layered narrative, but nevertheless one story from beginning to end, the story that makes sense of everything, the story inside which our universe exists. And that penny dropping was huge, and helped me to see that what the Bible brings to the table of critical theories that is really unique. And for people wanting to chase up sort of footnotes, Herman Doivert is really good on this, is that the Christian view, the biblical view of reality, is a story. It's not a static set of principles or forces or laws. It is irreducibly narrative. And that makes all the difference in the world. So that was the first thing. And the second thing that helped me to see what a book like this might look like was my first encounter with Augustine's City of God. It was a rainy week in the Yorkshire seaside town of Bridlington. I was on holiday with my parents, and I took the City of God along because, it's one of those books that you probably ought to have read as a Christian. I didn't really know much about it, so it was really big. Thought I'd try and do it on holiday. And I think it rained all week. And so there was lots of time in the house just reading, and I plowed through it. And, to be honest, Travis, most of it just went over my head, all the references to the gods and the heroes. I didn't know what he was talking about. But the thing that stayed with me was paradigm shifting, which is that he uses the Bible storyline in the second half of the City of God. He just tells the story from before Genesis, with the angels to Revelation. He uses that as a framework to critique late Roman culture, and a framework so powerful that he ends up telling the story of Rome better than Rome can tell its own story. He out-narrates, to use a little phrase from John Milbank, he out-narrates Rome at its own story. And from the little bit that I understood of the City of God, I thought, this is the way to do it. If you want to try and engage with late modern culture in a way that brings the Bible to bear in its sort of full throttled force and nuance and carefulness on the culture, this is the way that it needs to be done, unfolding the whole Bible story as a lens through which to look at the culture. And so with those two bits in place, it just took a lot of reading and thinking and listening to sermons and trying to work out how that biblical narrative engages with late modern culture at its different key turning points.
That that is just so fascinating, hearing the background. It helps me to understand so much more of how you built the book and how you constructed it. Looking at the book for a moment, just the title, help us with, I know it's very simple, biblical critical theory. Why that title though? Because I actually was in preparation for this conversation. I saw someone had posted a video about your book. So I went to watch it, and they spent the first maybe 5 to 10 minutes going off on the title. And I didn't think a thing about it at first. And I went, well, I'll ask him. So what is the point of the title? And help us to even understand, most of our audience isn't necessarily in the world of academia. So why do we need to understand or interact with critical theory? I think you've alluded to it already, but I'd like to hear more.
Yes, it has been a bit controversial, hasn't it? In a way that I guess I wasn't particularly expecting, but I'm not surprised by. So let me just reconstruct how I arrived at the title, and then if we want to do a little bit about why it's become a talking point, we can do that. So my first encounter with the term critical theory was in a unit that I did as an undergraduate called Modern Critical Theory, where we went through a series of post-Kantian, so 19th and 20th century philosophers and social theorists. There was a week on Marx, there was a week on Foucault, a week on Derrida, week on Kristeva, if I remember correctly. And so that was what I thought critical theory was, and that was the way that the term was used in the circles that I was moving in those days. It's a post-Kantian way of engaging with society that seeks to critique social norms, critique the status quo in view of a vision of how society ought to be, in view of something better. And that's what I think the Bible provides, and that's why I'm calling it biblical critical theory. So the way that I try and parse out that idea in the book is to say that these critical theories are doing three things. They're making certain things in the world viable. In other words, they become believable, they become possible for you. So one example from critical theory would be, you might laugh at the idea of a socialist revolution. You just might think that's never going to happen. That is absolutely impossible. And then you read a whole bunch of Marx, and you gradually come to see that, oh, I can get now how at least he thinks this is going to happen. It makes sense. It becomes a possible thing in your world. So it's made viable by reading that particular author. And the Bible does the same thing. So you know most people today would just laugh at you or just be really puzzled if you talked about the idea of trusting the promises of the God of the Bible. Like, what does that even mean? And yet, you read the account of Abraham, and you read the way that the psalmists struggle with God, and you read the New Testament and Jesus, and you gradually come to see, okay, now I understand what it would be like to trust God's promises. That becomes a viable thing for me. I may still not do it, but I can see what it would feel like. I can see what it looks like. It's a part of my world now. So the Bible has made that viable. The second thing that critical theories do is they make certain things in the world visible. One, great, powerful example of this is the way in which 20th century feminisms have made visible the way in which women are unfairly and unjustly treated in ways that may not have been visible previously. So people may have simply ignored them, or simply not registered, not seen that certain ways that women have been treated historically have been very unjust. But feminism shines a light on that and says, look, you've got to notice this in society. Don't be blind to this anymore. And again, the Bible is also making things visible. You may have seen 1,000 sunsets in your life, but never have thought, the heavens declare the glory of God. I'm seeing something of God's glory in those colors in the sky. And then, you read the Psalm, and it says, notice this, like when you see your next sunset, remember that is showing you God's glory, and it's made visible for you in a way that just may have flown under your radar previously. And the third thing that critical theories do, that the Bible also does, is they make certain things valuable. And one, I say, characteristic example of this from 20th century critical theories is that many of them really prize the transgression of norms. If there's a norm or a tradition, chances are we ought to destabilize it or transgress it or upset it in some way. That's a characteristic, a signature move of these critical theories. And the Bible similarly teaches us what to value in the world. So my pre-Christian self would have looked at you askance if you'd have said, you know what, in your life, serving other people is something that you should really seek to do. It's one of the things you should really value. I'd have said, like, what universe are you living in? Why on earth would that be beneficial to me? But then you can't read far into the New Testament or the Old without seeing that this is something that God and Jesus really, really value. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And then in Philippians 2, Paul says, have this same mind in you that was also in Christ Jesus, being in very nature God, and so forth. And you say, okay, well, I've got to rewire my thinking then, because serving other people is clearly something that's very, very important for God. And if it's important for him, it ought to be important for me. So this thing should be valuable. And so on all these different points, that the Bible is performing these same moves as these critical theories are doing, making things viable, making them visible, making them valuable. And that's the sense in which there is a critical theory in the Bible. I called it biblical critical theory rather than Christian or theological critical theory, because I think because of the spell that first Bible overview cast on me that I haven't recovered from yet, that the treasure is in the text. It is the Bible story itself that is the powder keg that sort of explodes into culture. And, theologians can be helpful in pointing us to certain bits of the Bible, but where it really gets exciting, where the blood really starts racing and the heart really starts beating is in the biblical text. Now, I really wanted to make that the heart of the book, not this or that theologian, however, worthy they are, but just to, in a sense, to get theology out of the way and let the reader encounter the texts face to face, get their nose dirty in the Bible. And so that's why it's biblical rather than, Christian or theological. And finally, I think that the reason that the title is a bit perplexing for some people is that there's a different sense of critical theory that's risen to prominence in our society, in Western society, particularly US society in recent years. And it's sort of sucked all the oxygen out of the bigger sense. So when people think of critical theory today, it's usually, certainly in the news media, it's usually Frankfurt School critical theory, which is a bunch of German and Austrian philosophers early in the 20th century who were using Marx to try and read culture. We get this term cultural Marxism. That's what they were trying to do. And even narrowly, the idea today of critical race theory, taking ideas from Derek Bell at Harvard in the late 20th century and other scholars, and trying to read race through this critical lens. And I think quite understandably, because that's the only sort of critical theory that really gets talked about, that's what most people think it is today. And so, they read the title Biblical Critical Theory and they think I'm doing Christianity as Marxism, or I'm doing critical race theory through the Bible or something like that. And part of the reason for choosing the title is to push back against that narrower sense, and to make a case for this broader sense of critical theory for our understanding of society. Partly because I think if the narrow sense is the only sense we've got, we're going to find it very hard to understand what the critical theorists themselves are talking about. It's like you cut anything out from the broader ecosystem in which it flourishes and that nourishes it, and it becomes really hard to understand that thing is, what that thing is. We don't exist, ideas don't exist in isolation, they have histories. And so if we just focus on the Frankfurt School, thinking that it's sort of parachuted out of the sky at some point with all these weird ideas, it just becomes really hard to engage with it meaningfully and to understand what it's saying. And so I do want to say that this broader sense of critical theory, this post-Kantian sense of what these different critical theories are doing, is really important. And if we only have the narrow sense, then I think we're selling ourselves short in our cultural critique.
There's so much that you cover that I think it's almost shocking to the system for so many Christians. Even as I was walking through the book and reading through it, I see how you walk through all of the, you start in Genesis and then you build a case piece by piece as you're looking at the different genre. You go through the fall, you're talking about Babel, you're talking about the covenant. You're moving us through the scripture, and you're weaving in this contemporary cultural framework at the same time, where you are using the scripture and the power structures and the plausibility structures. If I could go that far, you can correct me. And showing this, as you said, I love how you use 3 V's, by the way. The preacher in me was like, hey, that'll preach those 3 V's. Really do come alive because you help people to see the contemporary culture through the lens of scripture, and how many of the issues that they faced at that time are not so different from the time that we're in right now. And I think that's where people, they get that part of it. They might get lost in the terminology, critical theory, they weirded out because of what you just mentioned. But when you start helping people to see, I can show you our world through the lens of the scripture, that awakens the imagination in a greater way to see also the as you said, the viability and how the Bible really does out narrate. I want to stop on that for a moment. Talk about what it means. You alluded to it again with Augustine, but what does it mean that the Bible out narrates our world?
There are certain narratives in our society that try to explain pretty much everything, including Christianity. So that the Freudian, for example, would say to you, I can tell you what Christianity is, actually better than Christians can themselves, because it's all to do with projecting a father figure into heaven, and it's sort of, sublimated desire for the Father and so forth. And I can tell you a story about Christianity that really explains it at a fundamental level. And the Darwinist could do the same. Christianity has arisen as sort of a survival structure, and there are evolutionary reasons why this would be a good story to believe in order to survive. And so I can tell you what Christians believe better than they can explain themselves. And there are a number of these stories in society, all trying to out-narrate the others. In other words, trying to fit all the other stories within their frameworks. I'm the big story, and all the other ones fit inside me, and I can make sense of them all actually really better than they make sense of themselves. Northrop Frye, the literary critic, has a very interesting argument. He says, for the longest time, that was the Bible. in our society. The Bible was a story that made sense of all the other stories, the story inside which we live. But sometime, perhaps in the 19th century, the Bible stopped being that, and it became a story that we scrutinized rather than the glasses that we viewed the world through. And other stories came to make sense of the Bible. And that's the position in which we find ourselves today. You know, any number of people will queue up to tell you what the Bible really is and how it really came about and what's really going on with Christianity. You know, from, I don't know, Dan Brown down, you know, this is the real story. But the thing is that the Bible also does that to all the other stories. The Bible tells this grand sort of sweeping story of the universe that explains why other people are telling the stories that they are and why they think the way they do. And, you know, as Augustine does with Rome, the sort of the claim is that the Bible actually explains Rome better than the Romans can, better than their own story. And it explains late modernity better than the story that late moderns tell about themselves. And that's what out-narrating means, making sense of other stories, of other positions, better than they're able to account for themselves. Sort of pointing out the contradictions or the blind spots or the holes in other stories, explaining why on the premises of those stories there must necessarily be those holes, and then showing why there aren't similar holes in one's own story.
Mm. Taking that idea of narration, you actually do something that I had not seen before. I'm sure others have heard of it, but this term diagonalization, that was a new term for me. And you show these things that seem to be contradictory at face value, and then you show how the Bible connects the two. Can you talk a little bit, help us to understand more about what this diagonalization means? Because I had to read it twice before I really understood it, maybe 4 or 5 times, before I really got what you were trying to lay down there. So explain to us diagonalization. Can I even say it right? Diagonalization. I feel like I'm in Finding Nemo, you know, like like we're anemone, sea anemone. I mean, diagonalization.
You got it. That's exactly the way to pronounce it. It's a long word, but it needn't be. And in a sense, the word itself isn't important. Like, you can call it what you want. The important thing is to put a label on it so that you can identify it. Because I think it's something that Christians have done in cultural criticism for millennia. I think it's something that Augustine does in The City of God. But until you stick some sort of label on it, it tends to just pass you by and you don't recognize it. So the reason to call it diagonalization was just, in a sense, to put, you know, when you have a scan done in the hospital and you drink a dye beforehand so you can see things that would remain opaque otherwise. It's just like a dye to show this thing up. Let me explain it in terms of an example, because I think that's probably the clearest way to do it. So in Genesis 1, there's this wonderful picture of human beings created in the image of God. And there are 2 aspects to that image, and they're both beautiful and wonderful. The first is that it gives human beings an amazing dignity. Of all the things in God's amazing creation, only one thing is made in the image of God. So, you know, beautiful School of Wales is not in the image of God. That glorious sunset we were talking about a moment ago isn't in the image of God. You know, the greatest symphony ever written isn't in the image of God. The greatest painting ever painted, etc. Only human beings are in the image of God. And you say, wow, that is huge dignity, a huge sort of precious thing that we are. But there's also a sense in which that very same image is really quite humbling for human beings, because we're in the image of God, which means we're not God. We're not, if you want to put it this way, we're not top dog in the universe. That place is reserved for God alone, and we are his image. And so our identity is derivative and contingent on his. We're not self-defining. We're not self-sustaining. We're an image of someone else, of God. And there's no sense in Genesis 1 in which we're half dignified and half humbled, for example. But what modern anthropology does is it sort of takes these two biblical principles and rips them apart from each other. And so you'll have some modern anthropologies that go really hard on the humbling of humanity side of things. And, they will say things like, however uncomfortable it may be to us, we've got to face the fact that we're really just machines. We are extremely complicated machines, but at the end of the day, we're just machines. And there are key moments in modern thought where this comes through really clearly. So first chapter of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, that great foundational text of modern political thought, he says we are cogs and springs and strings and wheels, really, human beings. And then Julien Alfred Lamétrie wrote a book called L'Homme Machine, the man machine, the human machine. So there's this strand of thinking that says, really, we're just complicated machines, or really, we're just animals. There's nothing qualitatively different. And there's a sense in which that grasps, in a distorted way, something of the truth of Genesis 1, in that, human beings are on the creature side of the creator-creature distinction. We're not God, created on the same day as the other animals. There is a certain, there's an animality about the description of human beings in Genesis 1. There's a creatureliness about them. And then there's another strand of modern anthropology, which really figures humans as gods, essentially. And John Milbank is brilliant on this in the early chapters of Theology and Social Theory, where he traces the way in which the God of voluntarism, so a God whose will is unstoppable and unquestionable, becomes the norm for human beings in modernity. So this God of voluntarism, for example, if he wants 2 and 2 to equal 36, 2 plus 2 to equal 36, he can, because nothing can stand in the way of his will, not even the laws of logic. And Milbank argues, now I think it's a persuasive argument, that there's a certain modern anthropology that puts humans in the place of that voluntarist God. You must decide the meaning of your life for yourself. You must decide your fundamental identity for yourself. In other words, your will is the only thing that shapes reality in this voluntarist sort of way, and the only thing that should shape reality for you. And so therefore modern anthropology has these two ungainly streams to it. You're a machine. Oh, and also, by the way, you're a voluntarist God. So go and live your life in psychological peace, trying to conjure with those two incompatible anthropological elements. And then the modern Christian cultural critic comes along and diagonalizes those two streams of modern anthropology, not by saying, oh, we need to meet in the middle then. Perhaps we're half animal and half voluntarist God. Let's split the difference. No, the Christian cultural critic says, wait a minute, these two incompatible, seemingly, modern anthropologies have actually dismembered a beautiful biblical harmonious whole, the image of God. And they've hacked off these two limbs, the creatureliness and humility of human beings on the one side, and the exalted, dignified status of human beings on the other side. They've hacked off those two limbs, and then they set them in opposition to each other. So now, you choose, are you an animal? Are you a machine on the one hand, or are you a voluntarist God on the other hand? And so the way to diagonalize them is to say, well, let's not start with that opposition. Let's start with the beautiful harmony of the image of God that has this principle of humility and this principle of exaltation in it, but manages to conjure with them in a way that they're not in opposition to each other. And so it's, if you like, to remember, it's the opposite of dismember, to remember the biblical truth, and to say, this dichotomy is false to begin with. And I think the reason that I prefer that example to explain it is that I think a lot of people have got the idea that diagonalization, or what's sometimes called the third way, is about splitting the difference. It's about saying we're half machines and we're half gods. I don't even know what that means. Like, that doesn't even make sense. And so it's not some sort of woolly cardigan and slippers wearing compromise where you try and sort of meet in the middle, whatever opposition you've got, whatever dichotomy you've got, let's try and meet in the middle. It's not that. It's let's try and find the biblical truth that the different poles of this dichotomy are misrepresenting and dismembering and twisting.
In talking about this idea of third way, I know you referenced Tim Keller quite a bit, and he actually wrote the foreword to your book, and he's been known to advocate for this third way. Why is the third way so important for us today in our current cultural moment?
I would tweak the language a little bit to begin with. I think part of the reason that third way often gets misunderstood is precisely because it's called third way. It makes it sound as though it comes along after the dichotomy, and it would be more precise to call it a first way. So the image of God comes first, and then the modern world, sort of rips apart these two anthropologies. And what you want to do is get back to the first way rather than bringing along some sort of third way that tries to mediate between them. I guess, well, I suppose the first reason why it's important is the same in any cultural moment, because it's biblical, and you're always going to be wanting to judge whatever culture you're in by the yardstick of the Bible, whatever that culture is saying. And so that's the fundamental bedrock reason why I think this is really important, because you're always wanting to go back to the Bible. Perhaps one reason why it's important for our particular cultural moment that we're living in right now is that we seem to have got addicted to these dichotomies in a quite unusual and quite dangerous way. Some people say it's because of social media and that helps to polarize us. And look, I don't know why. But I think it's hard to avoid the fact that our politics is very polarized in a way that it hasn't always been. Bipartisanship seems dead in the water in a way that it's not always been. That the means of gaining and keeping power seem to be, the rule book seems to have been thrown out of the window somewhat in a way that it's not always been. So these dichotomies are particular, I think, in our society. And it's not just politics. I think culturally as well, there's a strong argument to be made that we live in a particularly dichotomized society. And to the extent, therefore, that Christians are to seek to bring every culture and society up and look at it through a biblical lens, that we want to be focusing on these dichotomies and showing how they are damaging and unnecessary often, and also just painting and setting forth for people a more healthy biblical vision for society, which isn't captivated by these dichotomies in the way that our society seems to be at the moment.
Let's hone in on that for a moment, especially when it comes to the church. You mentioned that our culture, I mean, we have a certain way of thinking, and our culture, we get caught up in our cultural moment, and it's hard to know the currents that we're in and following. But what you've done is to shine a light into the scripture, and again, going back and forth between our contemporary cultural moment. But looking at your book and I'm trying to think of the pastor, the leader, what they do with this, because it is very academic. It is very academic, even though you did a great job of interweaving contemporary illustrations. I mean, you even have Winnie the Pooh characters that come out in there, which I appreciated as a father. And then, of course, Rocky.
Particularly close to my heart.
I mean, you started calling a philosopher Eeyore. I was like, where are we going here? But it was great. And then I actually loved your questions. I've never encountered questions at the end of a chapter, which made me actually I mean, really stop and think. You kind of sometimes just skip through them. Yours is like, no, take it 1 minute, explain it like you're explaining it to a 10-year-old in 100 words or less. And I'm like, wait, what? And suddenly I'm setting my timer on my phone trying to figure out how to do this. But I'm trying to break it down into a church, like a church member, because some people are extremely intimidated by this. They think it's not for them, but it is. It really is, because you're helping people name their worlds. You actually allude to that with Adam in the garden when he has to name the animals. Why is that such an important thing for people to see in their understanding of culture now?
Well, I suppose to name something is to make it visible. You know, language is really powerful, isn't it? The words that we use to talk about life shape our sense of life, shape our sense of what's possible and what's good and what's bad. And so language matters. And I think, therefore, for Christians, the language we use to talk about our world will determine what we think of it and how we live in it. And so we want always to be seeking to use biblical language and biblical categories when we engage with our world. Not necessarily to talk to people who have no biblical background, because that might not make a huge lot of sense to begin with. But in our own thinking, we always want to try and begin with biblical categories, because otherwise you're eating at a table that's been set by contemporary culture with its menu, you know, its categories, its language, and that may or may not be biblical. But you want to let the Bible set its own table, and say, well, if we were to strip it down and begin with only biblical language, how would we talk about what's going on? And I think there's real value in that exercise, because it makes you look at things afresh, and it makes you question the commonplaces and the linguistic habits that we've got into to describe our world. Travis, can I jump back? I know this is probably not
Sure.
what you're supposed to do in a podcast, but can I jump back to my previous answer? Because I'm thinking, what are people going to think when they hear me talking about let's get over these dichotomies? And I think there's one way that could be misheard that I think is really, really dangerous, and I just want to try and correct it. So I was saying in the previous response, let's try and mediate, or let's try and sort of get past these dichotomies. And I can hear a Christian sort of screaming at her radio, or, you know, at her smartphone at this point. Well, hold on. The Bible is full of dichotomies, like heaven and hell, for example, you know, God and creation. Like, you can't get rid of all dichotomies, because then you've got rid of the Bible. And first of all, yes, absolutely. But secondly, I think it's therefore becomes a question of where your fundamental dichotomies are. So Christianity, absolutely, biblical Christianity is founded on some basic dichotomies. Like, there's God, and then there's everything else. The creator-creature distinction, as theologians call it, that's a dichotomy. You don't mix those. And secondly, you know, the final destination of, as Augustine would say, the two cities, you know, eternal destruction and eternal life. That's a hard dichotomy. But what that means for the Christian is that within the cyclum, within these days in which we now live before the final judgment, there can be and is nuance and no hard dichotomies. And that can only be true for the Christian because our dichotomies find themselves outside of the here and now. You know, the creator-creature distinction is not a feature of late modern culture, for example. And we're not yet at that moment of final division and dividing the sheep from the goats. And what that means is that everything that I encounter in culture today is going to be a mixture. Is going to be some good in it, because the beauty of creation and being made in the image of God hasn't utterly been erased. It's been palimpsestically written over by sin and obscured and twisted by sin, but it hasn't been completely erased. But neither is anything in this world here and now utterly and exhaustively evil in every possible way that it could be. So everything's a mixture. But it's only a mixture on the basis of those fundamental dichotomies that structure it. And the reason that that's important for the Christian is that I can have a working sense of good and evil. but I don't have to find them in the here and now. I don't have to find my measure for what's good and evil here and now. And so I can find nuance in culture. Not that everything is 50-50, not that everything is half good and half bad, but everything's a mixture in the last days. Because, as Christ himself says, nothing is good, no one is good but God alone. And therefore no human institution is utterly, we've seen this in the church in recent years, haven't we? That the church, insofar as it is a human institution, is a flawed institution. And many of its leaders have shown themselves to be profoundly flawed. Everything's mixed in this present age. But that doesn't mean that I have to say, well, everything's just relative and there's no good and evil at all, because I have dichotomies that are outside the current cultural moment. The problem is if you don't have the creator-creature distinction, and if you don't have a final judgment, then you have to find your measure for what's good and evil in the present age. Otherwise, you don't have a measure for what's good and evil, and you do become the relativist for whom every position is just as good as every other. That's where your dichotomies come in. So it's in a sense, you're making immanent, you're making here and now the basic structure of good and evil that Christians find outside the here and now. And that's one reason, I think, why, for example, our politics is so dichotomized, because people are investing it with this ultimate religious significance, and they're getting their measure for what is good and evil from within the political world in a way that Christians don't have to do and shouldn't do if we've read the Bible carefully enough, because we'll know that there is a measure for good and evil, but it's not riveted into a particular political party of any stripe in this world. Doesn't mean they're all 50-50, half good, half bad. There's still differences, and you can still say, I much prefer this party to the other. But it does mean that none of them gives me my measure for what is good and evil. So that's the rather labored footnote that I wanted to give. We do have dichotomies, but they're very different to the sort of dichotomies that are ripping our society apart at the moment. And Christians can only have nuance in our engagement with contemporary dichotomies because we have these other fundamental dichotomies that structure our view of the world.
Bringing that back, actually bringing this out, something that you did that I was quite surprised by is you actually talk about sin and judgment, which I was surprised. Most books that I would think of this type of stripe just encountering don't talk about this type of thing. And this is where I went, this is very different, because you've gone from the secular academic world and you've really brought the Bible to bear upon all that. Again, you out narrated, I would say, and help us to see that. Why is that concept so important for us to keep in mind, this idea of sin and judgment as we do our cultural critique?
The knee-jerk response is because it's there in the Bible. We want to bring the whole of the Bible to bear on the whole of culture. And it's not our job to decide which bits of the Bible story we want to keep and which we want to get rid of. And so that's the sort of entry-level answer. The slightly more developed answer is that you can't make sense of, well, either the Bible or contemporary culture really without some sense of where things have gone wrong. And so if you excise sin and judgment from the Bible, you've got a sort of, I guess, a meaningless story in the end, just a wheel spinning in the air with no friction in reality. Like if there's no sin and judgment, then why did Jesus need to die? And then why is the resurrection such good news? And what's the final judgment all about? Like the whole house of cards comes tumbling down if you don't have a robust biblical sense of the human offense against God and God's anger at that offense. And I don't think this is sort of an alien idea to, all the critical theories have a sense of what's gone wrong. They've just got different senses to the Bible sense, and often more superficial senses as well. So there's often a diagnosis of the problem in sort of non-biblical critical theories that say, look, it's to do with the way society is structured or to do with power relations in society. And if we just get that right, then, they wouldn't put it in these crass terms, but essentially we'll get the paradise on earth that we long for. We just got to educate people differently, get education right, or get the structure of society right, or get the economy right, or whatever it is. And then, this was the sort of ideology of the French Revolution, and why one of the reasons why the guillotine was so attractive. It's if we can just start from a position where everything's right, then the golden age will be ushered in. If we just get rid of the people who think wrongly, I know it's not great to kill them, but the prize that we're aiming for is so much greater, so much more to be striven for, that it's worth, cracking a few eggs to make the omelette. But the Bible says that you're only scratching the surface. You can do what you want with education, and it's good to try and make it better. And you can do what you want with the economy and society. It's good to try and make them better. But in that old, hackneyed but really helpful phrase, the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. And, you're never going to really address what's wrong with society and the world unless you bring it down to the level of the human heart. It's an internal problem to all of us, not an external problem out there in the world. And therefore, I think this biblical diagnosis of, the hill that needs to be climbed to make society better is much grimmer in many ways. It's a more sober, it's a darker sense of the challenge that faces us. Because in a sense, the challenge is us. Like, biblically speaking, there are no good guys out there trying to save the world. People are doing wonderful things, but that's not the solution, because those people themselves are, carrying around in their hearts this sinful nature, as the Bible puts it as well. And I think, we've seen that in recent years. Even some of the most revered Christian leaders end up damaging themselves and wrecking their churches. And that's not just getting the right leader is not the solution. There is only one solution, and his name is Jesus. Because nothing else gets deep enough to deal with this fundamental human problem, which is sin. So it's a bleak diagnosis. But I think it's also a diagnosis that stands up to scrutiny. There's Chesterton said, didn't he? It's the only empirically verifiable doctrine, sin. But, in the sense that, all these church scandals sort of show that none of us are simply part of the solution. None of us are simply the good guys doing the right thing. And I think views of society that say, there are the good guys out there and there are the bad guys, and we just hope the good guys win because everything that they're doing is great, strain to make sense of the whole of reality. You have to have quite a selective view of reality to think that the only problem is education or some groups of people out there who are ruining it for everyone else. And I think the biblical view of sin just rings truer if we open our eyes and don't look selectively at what's going on in society. So for all those reasons, I think sin is really, really important to have as part of a full-orbed approach to cultural critique. You can go too far, can't you? Some Christian cultural critique seems to know only Genesis 3 and no other chapter of the Bible. And all you're ever doing is denouncing and condemning and rejecting culture. And that's not biblical either.
Well, you're talking about this idea of sin, but not idea, the concept of sin, and then this idea of freedom and autonomy. You bring that out in a way where you really zoom in on Babel early on, and our desire for autonomy apart from God, just this idea of casting off restraints, of being and making a name for ourselves, and doing basically the end justifies the means, whatever we need to do in order to get there. And then you delve into the world of technique, and it's interesting that you brought that out. I wanted to talk about that for a moment, because I don't think many leaders in our churches think about this concept of technique, because it's best practices. Whatever I need to do to get him to Jesus, to get him in there, that's what I need to do. But in doing so, they employ means that become actually very dehumanizing in the process, because people become products to get to glory rather than understanding the fully embodied self of who they are. But can you talk to us or explain to us a little bit about what is the bad of technique and what is the good of technique? And even just what is technique might even be a better way to start off before we get any further into it. Go ahead.
I'm getting it from a French a Christian Protestant French theorist in the mid-20th century called Jacques Derrida. And he wrote 3 books on technique, the most famous of which is The Technological Society. And he goes into huge depth about this thing that he thinks fundamentally characterizes modern society. And I think he's got a really good point. He says it begins before modern society with ancient magic. And he says what magic tries to do is shortcut processes. It tries to get you the result right here, right now. And in a sense, it's an ethic of efficiency. What's my quickest way to get what I want? Well, say a magic spell, go to the shaman, whatever. You know, that's the way to shortcut doing it the hard way. And he says that this same instinct of technique fundamentally characterizes modern society. So it's all today about efficiency. What is the most efficient way to get done what I need to get done? And part of his critique of it is that the tragedy of this is that efficiency, which is a means, not an end, has itself become the end. So what we seek to do now is become more efficient. Why? Well, because that's more efficient. Yeah, but why are we trying to be more efficient? Because that's more efficient. It's a means in ends clothing, I think is the way that I put it in the book today. And you can see this in caricatures of the profit motive in business. Why do we make more profit? Because we want to make more profit. Well, why? Because that's what we're about. Yeah, and it becomes circular. And this paradigm of efficiency, he is arguing, sort of, it's the air we breathe. Like, that is default mode for us now. How can we get it done in the quickest way possible? And I think the point that you're making is that has crept into church culture as well. You know, what, to put it in this crass way, what magic spell can I say in order to get where I want to get to grow my church or to do whatever it is? It doesn't have to be growing a church, it can be whatever. And Elul is saying that the huge danger in that is that you lose any sense of greater ends. That efficiency, it works reasonably well as a means among other means. It's not terribly healthy if it's the only means, but it's a terrible end, because what it does is it begins molding human beings around the goal of efficiency itself. So it takes human beings out of the center of things, and we then, you and I, become means to the end of efficiency. And that dehumanizes us in all sorts of ways. And, you know, the lifestyle of productivity is one of the ways in which this happens. You know, I see my life as about becoming more productive, and I can become really, really productive if I dehumanize myself in significant ways, and if I become a slave to that ethic of productivity. And therefore you very much put the cart before the horse, and you end up seeing human beings as a means to the end of greater efficiency and greater productivity, rather than seeing efficiency and productivity as part of your toolbox of means, along with others, to the end of a flourishing human life. And so that's his critique, part of his critique of modern society. I think is incredibly powerful. Look, I see it in my own life. I'm not sort of talking as someone who's, thank goodness that I don't, get sucked in by this productivity idea and this efficiency idea. No, it's a struggle for me. I would be surprised if it's not a struggle for everybody today, because it's so ingrained in the way that we're catechized in modern society. I want to grow, I don't know what it is, my personal brand or my, footprint online or whatever it is. And that becomes the end. And I become a means, if you like. I commoditize and marketize myself. This is the whole social media thing, isn't it? In order to make myself into a means to achieve that end of increased efficiency and increased productivity. And you don't have to read far into the Bible to get the sense that is not a flourishing human life. That is not how God wants us to be. We are not a means to that end. So that's Elul's idea of technique.
I want to expand that a little bit, if you don't mind. How do we then counter that idea, because I've had this conversation about technique before. Alan Noble talks about it in his book, You Are Not Your Own. And I remember getting into a conversation because I've seen this happen in churches where even the staff become this, we got to get them in the door, we got to get the program. I mean, it just becomes production. And then I hear people say, well, we don't need technique. But there is an aspect where we do need to be good stewards. We want to be faithful with what God has given us. And we don't throw technique at the door, because if we just say, oh, I want it to be altruistic, I just want to love, I want to be able to do all these things, that's just not where we're at right now. I mean, even you as a professor have to produce, you have to teach, you have to write, we have to all do all these things. And we are to bear fruit. By their fruits you shall know them. How do we keep that intention, that tension between bearing fruit and being faithful stewards, and this idea of dehumanized machines that are just there to produce?
The first piece of the jigsaw is making that temptation visible by talking about it. I think that the greatest danger is if you don't even realize that's the air you breathe. So, we read some of the old writers, people like Kant and David Hume, and we will just be astonished at how they can go, in the space of a couple of paragraphs, from brilliant philosophical insight to some of the most odious racism. And we will say, like, how did they not see that? And I think one of the reasons is that was just the air that they breathed. Like that wasn't visible to them as something that was odious and obnoxious. And I fear that technique is like that for us. Our great grandchildren will look at the books we read and write, and look at the Christian ministries, and they will say, how can they not see that they're sacrificing themselves and their humanity on the altar of this thing called a faith? Or perhaps it'll be even worse for our great-grandchildren. I don't know. But, the principle's the same. It's if everybody around you reflects that same ideology to you, it just becomes invisible. So the first thing is name it, read some LO, see how it works. But the second thing, I think, is, it's George MacDonald's expulsive power of a greater affection, isn't it? It's no point just knowing what the problem is. You've got to put something better in its place. And I guess one way to do that biblically is to center, well, first of all, to center God, and then secondly, to center human beings and relationships. It's back to Genesis 1, isn't it? Human beings are in the image of God. That's where that God invests his dignity, not in structures or programs, but in human beings. And so in the same way that the mantra for the Watergate investigation was follow the money, like let everything else go and fade into the background, let the money lead us to what's going on here. And in the same way, that Bill Clinton had that lovely little phrase, didn't he? It's the economy, stupid. Like, forget the other stuff. This is where the game is happening. I wonder if for the Christian, the mantra needs to be, it's people, stupid, or follow the people. Like, it's the people who are in the image of God, and it's relationships, a relationship with God first of all, and then relationships with other people that seem to be privileged. Certainly in the Genesis 1 account, it's so drippingly relationally rich. Very little about structures at that point. And so to purposefully prioritize and center people, human beings, in our thinking and also in our language. I think we airbrush out the humanness out of our language very often. There's a way of talking, and it happens in universities. I'm sure it happens elsewhere in society. We've started talking about spaces. What's happening in the student space? What's happening in the education space? And, in a sense, that's just innocent language. You've got to use some sort of word. But it is very interesting how that takes the human beings out of the situation, makes it structural, makes it an object. Whereas if we were to say, what are we going to do with the people in our classrooms? How are we going to teach these human beings? That would give you a different predisposition, a different set of sensitivities to the question. And I think as well, we can overlay our humanness with lots of language that instrumentalizes humanity. So, we talk about producers and consumers, for example. And again, I don't want to say never use those words. There's a usefulness to them. But unless we come back to the fact that what we're really talking about is human beings made in God's image, if we don't have that as, if you like, the compass that orients us in everything that we think about. So we're not talking about, I don't know what you call it, to bums on seats for churches or whatever it is. We're talking about human beings made in the image of God. Keeping that human language central, I think, is one guardrail that we can use, and I'm sure there are many others, to try and stop ourselves defaulting into this structural, dehumanized efficiency and productivity paradigm. Keep the human being central.
Talking about humanity, you get into Exodus and you talk about the emancipation narrative. Really, I can't remember the exact terminology. You refer to the emancipation narrative, and you drew out how that is so influential in so many different groups today, and they use that terminology. Isn't, though, because so many of those groups are co-opting that language for themselves, but yet they're forcing, I mean, you're talking about language, and in our culture today, it's one of the most divisive things that you can see, is what do I use for my pronouns? What do I say about this? Who do I say about that? Everybody's worried about what word you say to a person. And even when I've been on Zoom calls, people have their chosen pronouns of what they want to say. How do we keep this narrative of Exodus valued, but how can we help other people see that narrative? Number two, how they're playing it out. And number three, how do we keep the biblical categories without co-opting or compromising the faith so that we don't enter into that fallen system? I think that's my question. There's a question in there somewhere, Chris.
Yeah.
There's a question in there somewhere.
And I think the fact that it is such a hard question to ask points out something really important and interesting in itself. It's that our cultural moment is a really complex one. And it's perhaps one that we haven't quite faced before in the way that we have now, that we are doing now. So Christians have been a minority, and a distrusted and perhaps hated minority for plenty of Christian history, like late Roman Empire. Like, right, we've got no problems with being the bad guys. That's, we have resources in Christian history to work out how to do that. And Christians have, for many centuries, lived in a society that more or less agreed with us on most things, and that was shaped in a Christian way, that had Christian instincts and Christian ways of seeing the world. What's new, I think, is that now we've got both of those at the same time. So our culture is very profoundly Christian in its instincts and the ways that it thinks about things. And one of these is the value of emancipation itself. Not every ancient culture was jumping up and down in glee at the idea of freed slaves and of slaves making their way out of a nation that was enslaving them and then gaining a new identity out in the desert. Like, that wasn't a Babylonian narrative. That's not an Assyrian narrative. That's like disaster, go and kill them. We don't want that. And yet there's one ancient culture that builds its sense of who it is upon this emancipation narrative, the Exodus. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt on eagle's wings and so forth. And that is such a refrain in the Old Testament. This is who you are. You are the emancipated ones. And that is wonderful. And that is a huge blessing. And so this idea of building one's identity upon a fundamental act of emancipation has become, again, to use Glenn Scrivener's term, the air we breathe. It's just become, well, of course, to us now. Like, we are the ones who have become and are increasingly becoming emancipated in all sorts of different ways. Like, that is our hard baked as our sense of identity. Now, that idea didn't come out of nowhere. If we'd been Assyrian, we wouldn't have defaulted to that position. And so there's something very deeply biblical, very deeply exotic about that instinct that we have about ourselves. And yet Christians today are framed as the enemies of that story very frequently. And that's the difficulty to navigate for Christians, because you don't want to sort of throw everything out and say, no, emancipation's terrible. You know, we shouldn't be emancipated, because that's, in a sense, that's our idea. Like, that's the Bible's idea. Like, it was brought into the tradition through the Bible. Nor would Christians necessarily want to say that all the many and various ways in which that narrative is being played out in society today are all thoroughly biblical themselves. And so you can't just embrace everything in the terms that they're offered to you, and you can't really just reject everything in the terms that they're offered to you as well, because the Exodus is a foundational biblical event, and we are the ones who are set free from sin. You know, this Exodus imagery ripples through the New Testament as well, and it so fundamentally shapes Paul's idea of what salvation is and what the cross has achieved. And so we find ourselves as Christians in society today being beaten over the head regularly with a stick. But it's our stick. Like, you took that stick from us. we gave you that stick. And so, and that's really hard. Like, that is a very complex position to navigate. And there are no easy ways. Like, there's no one sentence way through that in a biblically faithful way. You know, you can just say, oh, reject the whole thing, culture's corrupt, and just sort of try and burn it all. That doesn't work, because this idea of emancipation is so thoroughly biblical. Or you could say, well, let's just fall in line, and whatever it is that our particular culture happens to be saying to us, you know, at 6 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, then let's do that. Well, that's not really biblical either, because the Bible rubs up against every culture. And if it didn't rub up against every culture, it'd be locked into one particular culture, and that would open the door to all sorts of obnoxious imperialisms and colonialisms. You know, if the Bible identified itself fully with one particular culture, it would mean it was alienated from all the others, and it would be culturally specific, which gloriously it isn't. And so you find yourself having to do the long work, and, you know, think it through carefully and pick your way through this cultural landscape in ways that don't easily condense themselves into tweets or, you know, slogans, because of this ironic situation that we both find ourselves in, you know, Steve McAlpine's term as the bad guys. But the reason that we're the bad guys is because we're being judged by fundamentally biblical standards and found wanting by the way in which those standards are deployed in society.
Chris, this is so good, but I know that we're coming to the end of our time. What do you hope that the Lord does with this book?
I have been asked that question a couple of times. I find it really hard to answer, mainly because I don't know. Like, I don't know what, like, that's his job in a sense. Like, I wrote it, and it blessed me to write it, and I'm very grateful that it's been published. But now it's out of my hands. And, you know, if he wants it, you know, in an Isaiah sort of way to sit on a shelf and not get read, then that's, you know, he's the Lord. So in a sense, I don't want to prescribe what I think it should do. Let me answer it in terms of how it's really blessed me and how it's helped me. I think writing the book has helped me to find a way to be on the front foot in cultural debate. You know, not to feel that the only posture that Christians can take in contemporary culture is one of being attacked. To offer a trenchant and nuanced and robustly biblical critique of modern society, and also to unfold a better vision for society, a better vision for everyone, not just for Christians, to find that posture. It's also helped me to bring those two worlds I was talking about way at the beginning of this time together into conversation with each other. Like, what would the Bible say if it had a seat at the table of these critical theories? How would it shake things up? What would it do differently? And I hope it can encourage other Christians, as it has me, to see beyond the dichotomies that we've been talking about quite a lot today, and to see that they're not necessary and they're not final, and that there is a better way. That's not just a wishy-washy meet in the middle way, but a thoroughly biblical way to engage with these dichotomies that are really ripping our society apart. Like, they're not good. They're not doing us as a community, as a people, you know, as nations any good at all. Like, I don't think anybody thinks that they're fantastic, but the Bible offers a way to understand them and to critique them and to offer something better than them. And I just think that's really healthy, really exciting as well.
What's one final thought? Oftentimes we like to end our show, because we are Apollos watered. We want to water faith, and we jokingly say that we want to give people a water bottle to sip on in the week. What's a water bottle that people can sip on as a result of this conversation?
Well, if I were to give you an ocean, I'd say go and read the City of God, but that's, you can't carry that around with you and sort of dip into it. But I think the essence of the City of God is the power of the whole biblical story. So if you haven't done a Bible overview, grab one. Grab Nancy Guthrie's series of talks on her website. I think that the Chosen One is one of the, she's brilliant as a leading you through the Bible. And I think she's got a book called Better Than Eden, which is a Bible overview as well. Grab yourself a hold of that. Vaughan Roberts, God's Big Picture, Graham Goldsworthy's Gospel and Kingdom. These books that try and walk through the main points of the story of the whole Bible are just incredibly invigorating and nourishing, and give you a framework then into which you can add more detail later. Give you the map that you can then walk in. So I would say, if you've done a Bible overview, do a different one, go deeper, add some detail. If you haven't done one, just, before you go to bed tonight, grab yourself a Bible overview and go through it, whether it's a sermon series and like Nancy Guthrie's talks, or whether it's a book.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. And I recommend the book. I mean, it's not one that you're going to read really quickly. You're going to have to take your time and chew on it. I think going through a small group and sitting down, walking through it, the questions are excellent. And I feel like we've really only scratched the surface. We've gone into Genesis and Exodus. There's so much more, and I'd love to have you back on and we'll talk more about it, because I just think there's so much here that so many people will want to unpack. But Chris, thank you for your ministry. Thank you for the book. And thank you for coming on Apollos Watered.
Travis, it has been an absolute joy. And I do say that to everybody, but it really has. I've loved it. It is fantastic. I knew that you'd say that to me if I didn't get in there first. So it has. You can't gainsay me.
That's right. Thank you, brother.